Okay. Yeah, so I'm very excited about this panel because it's a quite relevant group of people coming together from EF, Flashbots, a builder, a relay. It's rare to have that combination together on stage. And we'll talk today about scaling the L1 and block building and the changes that come with that. So I'll hand the word to Kubi to introduce and to start the panel together. Thanks.
Yeah.
Quick round of applause.
Thanks, Chris. So good to be here. I'm Kubi from Gattaca, and today we'll be talking about changing an L1 and how it's going to impact block building. Just to kick it off, can we just do a quick round of intros and then just also say a few words on what you're working on today in Ethereum generally?
Yeah, sure. Hi, I'm Ansgar. I'm a researcher at the Ethereum Foundation, and with this recent kind of restructuring of the EF's kind of focus areas, I'm now co-leading our effort on scaling the L1.
Hello, I'm Toni. I'm also with the EF doing research there, and since very recently, I'm with the prototyping team.
Hi, Alex from the ultrasound team. Nowadays, I like to think of our role as we're trying to establish like the shortest path to the proposer from wherever the transactions are in the world that would like to make it on chain. Relay in a word.
Hi, I'm Phil, Flashbots. We are working on decentralizing the block building process across all domains, and I love MEV.
Great. So when thinking about the L1 protocol changes or the changing L1 landscape overall, I guess generally there are two forces that drive changes. One are core protocol changes and one are more market-driven changes. So keeping that in mind and then also thinking about who are the actors that are building blocks, and today that is obviously external actors through PBS that are more sophisticated or like more well-resourced, but you still have local builders, and even then you can spread it across home stakers and more professionalized node operators. So just keeping that in mind, from the protocol perspective or from the protocol designer's perspective, what are some of the key considerations that you guys make when making decisions, specifically thinking about block building, given that block building is a fundamental part of the protocol, or what makes the protocol work?
Yeah, that's a good question. Actually, I really like the distinction. So basically like the outside forces and the kind of the actual protocol itself changing. I think if you look back the last few years, actually what we've seen is that the core protocol has been relatively stable on the kind of front of block building at least. And that really kind of what we've seen is this successive sophistication of the entire kind of building MEV pipeline and all of these elements. And now that is changing again. I think we will over the next few years see much more meaningful changes also to the protocol itself. And so I think the way that affects building in particular is that I think as we want to scale, basically scaling means you have to kind of push a bit more into the well, basically, you have to be a bit more nuanced about what exact guarantees your protocol wants to keep and where you're willing to basically make trade-offs. And in particular, with the ability of every node to locally build blocks, I think where we will be going is have very robust censorship resistance solutions. I think Toni can talk about this also a bit more, but then be willing to lean more into more powerful nodes that specialize in building and are basically kept honest by these other mechanisms. And so yeah, I think as early as the hard fork in next year, like Amsterdam, we'll probably see meaningful changes. So just to, for example, briefly mention a simple topic, right? But like one simple way that we can leverage the block builder for scaling is we can make them attach some hints to the block that allows any verifier to parallelize verification. But that would not that's very easy to do, but it basically means the builder themselves can't parallelize, so the builder needs to still do the sequential work. And then the verifiers can run much more lightweight. And so I think we have a bunch of these opportunities where we can basically just leverage the fact that we have more powerful builders. And so I assume over time that will become a more enshrined distinction of different node types in the protocol. I'm not sure, Toni.
Yeah, that was, I think, a very good description already. Maybe just to add, I think every time when we talk about scaling, we often in the same sentence talking about, okay, what does it mean for the core values of Ethereum? I think it's super important to have this kind of clarity that scaling doesn't necessarily come with sacrificing any of those values like censorship resistance, security, decentralization, and everything that comes with decentralization. Yeah, just to add on the block level access list stuff, for example. Basically, just have builders attach cheat sheets for validators to execute faster, and this doesn't necessarily come with increased hardware requirements. Right, and then when we talk about censorship resistance, especially in a world where we outsource more and more blocks to professional entities, then it's of course important to kind of keep the core events, the core things that actually the decentralized set of validators, what they actually do, that we keep them at the validators. And I'm particularly thinking of attesting, for example. Who is deciding which chain we are building on? So the proposer's fork choice. Or who is deciding which transactions will eventually land on chain. That it's just something that we should be very careful about when we think about what do we want to outsource and how do we want to constrain the party that is essentially putting the blocks on chain.
And then just a perspective of practitioners or operators, like both a relay or a builder. Would you say you agree with that approach when thinking about like making protocol design decisions? And are there any considerations you guys would say these guys are not making, just given the practicality of some of the jobs that you guys basically fulfill as part of the supply chain? Maybe starting with Alex and then Phil.
Sure, yeah. Let me try. Yeah, no, I think the protocol does seem to keep in mind very much like what is very doable for us, and I feel also like there's a bit of a shift now more towards like, hey, what can we leverage? What can we give away, or what can we have taken on an extra responsibilities out of protocol to help us there? So yeah, I think definitely that distinction is being made, and that's interesting. I think maybe sometimes what could be interesting, and that's maybe just hard for me to see, is it's interesting sometimes to read a proposal and to see a suggestion like, now I've been talking a lot about trustless proposer payments and like what it would take to achieve that. And then it's super interesting to hear all the consideration that has gone in already. And then what I really like to do is just try to contribute that, hey, like we try to make proposer payments super guaranteed, and actually from where we're sitting, it doesn't seem to be like a very big topic, but there's some other things that we do think are really big topics and I think should be cared about. So yeah, I'm really enjoying that exchange, and I feel like there's listening to it and exchanging happening, especially here.
What are some of those things that you think that you really care about?
Sorry?
What are some of those things that you really care about?
Yeah. I think most of all, it is like, how can we add value to the block? And it's maybe not always clear what is lacking most to achieve that, like if that makes sense. So for example, we're very focused on latency now and increasing like the amount of time there is to get the block to the proposer. And then you see on the protocol side that sometimes there will be a massive change. Like now we're talking about reducing the block proposal window, and that's a huge shift. And that's totally fine for us. But it does mean a big shift, and we do wonder like what else could we be working on or building on, or which direction could we be going? Yeah.
Phil.
Yeah, so I recently started making ice cream. I don't know if any of you all are on this Ninja Creamy trend on TikTok, but it's like kind of this blender thing. You freeze anything, you put this blade in, and then it makes the ice cream texture. And as the ice cream melts, it kind of changes in mouthfeel and texture and all. It has like a life cycle, basically, right? So this is actually related, I promise. I always used to troll the EF and say like, hey, you all should be a lot more involved in this. Like you told us in protocol PBS was coming in 6 months, about 3 years ago or something like that. You told us there were going to be all of these changes. There's all these changes you can do to make the market more fair, more competitive, blah, blah, blah. And you all are kind of abdicating this responsibility. This was a few years ago. So I'm very glad to see that that's like totally not the case anymore. But the ice cream comment is like, as you eat this ice cream over a period of several days, once you refreeze it, it kind of crystallizes and the mouthfeel and the texture is not quite as nice. So what you can do is you can blend it again and it'll get it like almost back to that first point, right? And so I think the kind of L1 activist side is like blending the ice cream. It's a way to kind of almost shake up the market structure, get it to an initial point that has like a good mouthfeel, a good taste for the community. But there's only like so many times this is possible to do this, like, let's say, against the market. Specific things I worry about that maybe are being underpriced right now. I think in a lot of the rainbow staking and like L2 conversations, we're not thinking enough about kind of interactions of censorship resistance breaking, as well as centralization vectors in like various classes of these actors. I'm not sure you can cleanly compartmentalize this big node, small node thing the way it's like very convenient to want to do. I also worry a lot about latency. I think this is a difference from me as a practitioner to a lot of the research community. To me, like if latency is dominant in these systems, like TradFi has a structural advantage, and I think that's just a lot less salient to maybe researchers. So TLDR, we should be activist, we should blend the ice cream, but carefully, and maybe, you know, let's all talk together about it. And but I am bullish about the fact that at least we're starting the blender. Yeah.
Any comments from you guys about latency, centralization vectors that might not have been considered as much?
Yeah, I agree with what Phil just said, especially I mean, you were talking also about the enshrined proposer builder separation. I think we were blending this type of ice cream over and over again, and in the end it just turned out that maybe the recipe was not the right one. So maybe to stay with in that topic, I think you're totally right that we have to kind of, especially when it comes to latency, affecting especially the weak nodes in our network, that we have to pay a lot of attention to that and be careful when we adjust things in protocol to make sure that we also have them on the same page, and not only talking about validators but also talking about RPC providers and full nodes in general, people that just want trustless access to the chain. I'm not really, don't really have much more to add here.
Well, maybe one comment from my side. I think as we're now thinking about being a bit more direct or like more intentional again about how we want to see this pipeline evolve, I think one big question for us is to what extent do we want to be opinionated about what type of usage we are trying to primarily optimize around. And so for example, we're now focusing on scaling the L1, which is a very different focus, something that we haven't really done the last 5 years. That is a general purpose focus, right? So basically, like if we 10x the overall available throughput of the chain, that helps all types of applications equally. But then if you talk about like the actual block building and latency and inclusion mechanisms and maybe time to forced inclusion and last look and all these kind of properties of these systems, now all of a sudden you're talking much more specific types of applications, like types of DeFi, these kind of things. And for them, all of a sudden, these questions are like really, really important. And for some other types of activities, they don't matter at all, right? And so basically, like, how do we not only do we have limited resources within the EF, of course, to focus on these things, we also have limited availability to actually make protocol changes. So how do we balance these like general purpose improvements where we don't have to be opinionated versus specifically saying, look, we think over the next few years, these types of activities really matter a lot, and there we want to be the best chain possible, and these are the priorities to get there, right? And I think that's an internal tension that that's a tension that I think we as the ecosystem, but also specifically now we at the EF and as the QuadF community are kind of working through right now. And also that where like I think input is very welcome, basically.
And maybe just to add, because I think we started listening way more to the community in the last few years, because it felt like the scaling the L1 thing very much came from the community, right? Because as Ansgar said, this was not really a priority for many years. People were way more focused on the merge and everything that came with validators. And now it feels very much like that the community is actually on the driver's seat here and setting the direction.
Okay, so I guess from the protocol's perspective, the EF currently has put out these like key priorities, right? Scaling the L1 blobs and improving UX, which are driving a lot of the sort of protocol changes and priorities. From your perspectives, so thinking about the more market forces driven changes, could you talk about what you guys are seeing, starting with you, Alex?
Yeah. It's always a bit difficult to talk about because I feel like I don't quite have the authority being like only like the middle link passing through the data. But maybe where I would go is that it feels like skill is a big topic. We want as much as the block in the block as we can, and I feel like there's a very clear sort of direction that we're going, and we're anticipating that we're going to handle way more blobs, and like we're building for a future where that's the case. I feel like the improved UX is sort of the least clear to me, where I'm very curious what's going to happen, and it's also very unclear what direction to build much more. Where at least from my naive as a single Ethereum user, I want things to be way, way faster, right? Like I really like using Ethereum and I want it to go way faster when I use it, and I want to think about applications where I can make 4 Ethereum transactions in a row to sort of offer some kind of experience to the user, and that's going to take only half a second. So, you know, nobody's going to like kind of this future. And yeah, I don't know, I just have like a lot of questions there, I guess, also myself, of like, where are we going there? What are the options that we have? And what is also the protocol feeling is the right direction to go there.
But just like as an operator, do you see any like market structure changes that are purely driven by things you see in the market developing that are not directly related to any like protocol changes?
Yeah, I mean, what I see, like I think the last presentation we had is a really nice example of how much value can we get into the block? And there's clearly like a market force that's saying like, yeah, let's try and discover how else we can stuff more things into the block. There's clearly very strong market forces that constantly compel us that are about how late can we push sharing the block with someone. Clearly it matters a ton when we can just get those extra few milliseconds, and now we're even exploring how we can as a relay be much more distributed in the world, where it becomes very possible for the transactions to sort of make their way to this point where the proposer is, and there we take then our relay role of selecting out like what is the best offer that we can forward to the proposer. And yeah, I'd say those are very strong market forces. Yeah.
Phil?
Yeah, so I think one interesting market force is kind of what MEV is in some ways intended to capture. It's like, what are people using the things for? And you all touched, I think all 3 of you touched on this, like what are we building it for? One strong market force is like people want to trade on these systems. They want to issue assets and they want to trade. There's even sub-market forces there where there are people who want to do this in like a very regulated, traditional way. They want to issue their assets. They want to get more liquidity, quote unquote, but they're not really flexible on how to do that. There are people who are doing that in a more, let's say, Ethereum native way as well. And then there are people who are like building other use cases for these systems. I think how you weigh these things actually determines the system design. And there's a natural gravity in the market to build for kind of the trading use case because it is like the obvious use case. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think the question to me is like, how does that interplay with the other use cases? So let's say people need something that is very decentralized, very censorship resistant. And the fact that like we want it to go fast, like you're now excluding that use case from Ethereum. How do you weigh those 2 things against each other? I think that question is like above my pay grade, but the market definitely does pull like very heavily towards trading in my experience, very heavily towards actually lower latency, very heavily towards often centralization in various components as well. So
maybe something fun to add there is like, I think one of these forces that is important is like, yeah, the censorship resistance. And are we making sure that these transactions that are maybe like underserved in some ways and like one of the biggest use cases for crypto are actually being cared for? And something that's really tricky there is that, yeah, if you take, for example, literally censored transactions today, there just doesn't seem to be much of a market force there. Like a funny anecdote is that We recently started looking at filtering in blocks and enabling proposers to express a preference there and say like, hey, like for me, the blocks really do need to be filtered. We, by accident, were applying the filter to all blocks we were receiving for a month before we noticed that we were doing so. Why? Because there was just so few transactions that trip up the list at this point that it's like never on our mind. But that is, like as you said, the danger that we then maybe forget about them or build a whole system that just isn't even able to serve them anymore when the need arises.
Yeah, I mean, I think to that point, especially to what Phil was saying, I think to some extent there's a possibility to square the circle a little bit. I think that's just my personal opinion, but so for one, I think one pattern we can try to lean into is like a clear distinction between happy path and fallback path, and basically make it so that the system is both in the happy case very performant, but then also very robust in case the happy case does not work for individual transactions, for individual use cases, for users, maybe just in general, something happens overall that makes the entire system have to fall back to the not happy case. I think that kind of that two-lane approach, I think is something we can lean into with caution a lot. The other one is in terms of like which use cases are we trying to like optimize for. This is very much just my personal opinion. I think Ethereum has been in the past sometimes been in danger a bit of being too dogmatic and being like, look, financial use cases are just really bad. That's just people trying to get rich, and we're really actively trying to ignore their needs. I think that makes no sense to me either. I think you want Ethereum to become the widely used base layer for a lot of activity in general, so that you can then use it for whatever non-financial use cases you also have that are very important and that require these strong guarantees. But I think they're only useful if it happens on a base layer that overall plays a meaningful role. And so I think focusing in the short term on the types of use cases that actually allow us to win out that, and I understand not everyone likes that type of language, right? But like to actually like win out that competition, I think is a good thing. So I think actually like focusing a lot on these financial use cases to make sure that Ethereum as a whole matters, that then also benefits the non-financial use cases, I think is the way I would approach this.
Any responses?
I agree with you that it's possible, and I think we have our own also internal thinking and roadmap on how to do this. I think the tricky bit though is like there's like two axes. It's like how much does the use case actually need Ethereum, or could it use something else potentially? And I think that is somehow informally linked to decentralization in a way. And then there's like how much gravity or market power or money is like associated with the use case. And there are some use cases that I would say need Ethereum less, but like have a lot of market power. How do you balance that against the ones that need it more, but have like less market power, so you actually can square that circle? Like, for example, BlackRock ETF, right? Very, very valuable use case. Everyone wants it. We want to win, quote unquote, that. But does it really need Ethereum the same way, like, I don't know, many other, like even like an Aave or something like that? I don't know, I'm choosing a random example, might need Ethereum more.
Yeah, I think, again, opinions differ. I personally just feel like, you know, like an abundance mindset on these topics is the right thing to do. Like the internet is both very useful for TikTok, and it is very useful for dissidents and whistleblowers, and that's not some sort of tension. That actually is synergetic, and I think the same can be true for blockchains if you're being careful about it, right? Like it's not automatic, but like I think these things can be synergetic if done right.
So just getting a bit more technical, thinking about in the short to midterm, some of the hard fork headliners, could you outline a few and then talk about specifics that might affect block building, both from a perspective of a sophisticated actor, but also stakers and home operators?
Yeah, I can do so. Yeah, thinking like from one hard fork to the next, like Fusaka, and then we'll have Glamsterdam. Fusaka is already kind of nice when we think about attesting, for example. So validators not having to download all the blobs anymore, because they can just download the columns they need and then do sampling, still having the same, or basically the same security guarantees that they have today. And this is already a very cool change, because for a validator, bandwidth is already some of the biggest constraints. If you talk to solo stakers, that's what solo stakers complain most about. I'm not talking about the solo stakers that are run on data centers, but really the solo stakers that try to operate it from, I don't know, their homes, their basements. And from that perspective, the next hard fork will be already a great step into the direction of making the life of solo stakers easier. Of course, it comes with scaling the blobs. So we also scale the blobs in the same time or right after the hard fork, and then L2s get more space. Validators don't need to store all the blobs anymore and just store the columns. And I would say this is kind of a nice win-win we get there. Thinking even more into the future, like Glamsterdam, that seems to have a very much EL scaling or a L1 scaling focused, especially focused on the EL side, I would say. There are proposals like EPBS, enshrined payload block separation is the new name now. Block level access lists, delayed execution, but also EAPs like Fossil, right? The currently, I think, the best inclusion list proposal that is out there. All going into the right direction of not sacrificing anything of the core values while still allowing us to scale the chain. Especially thinking of Fossil, you could think of giving the responsibility of transaction inclusion into the hands of proposers that are actually not able to build blocks that are entirely full with, I don't know, 48 blobs or something, but still giving them the responsibility of deciding what are the transactions that they want to see on chain. And this allows the protocol then to leverage this decentralized, oftentimes anonymous set of attesters, validators, to get transactions on chain that maybe sophisticated builders would not like to see on chain.
Yeah, maybe just in terms of timelines, what to expect here. So as Toni was saying, Fusaka will be hard fork later this year. That one was kind of mostly scoped and finalized before we started to focus more again on kind of the L1 side of things. So that will focus a lot on DA scaling. So what you will see over the next 9 months on mainnet, roughly 9 months, I think, will be mostly just higher throughput in general. Like as we start to scale, we have this target of 100 million gas by the end of this year. It's not, that's more like a directional target. Like it's not, maybe we'll be above or below that, just kind of like a direction we want to go. Then starting next year, so say like the Glamsterdam hard fork, that's going to be optimistically March, April, maybe a bit later. That's when you will start to really see systematic changes. So I think if you think basically like the implications for relays, the implications for all the different market participants, I think that will start to change a lot going into next year. And so basically like general yeah, I mean, we talked about the individual features. We can go into them a bit more. But yeah, that's, I think, roughly what to expect.
Have you guys thought about any of them specifically? Some of the headliners like EPBS or Fossil or block level access lists and things like that, and like how they are, and also the scaling of blobs, for example, and how they would affect the relay or builders.
Yeah, a little bit. I'd say like, yeah, immediately our timelines are way shorter. The block merging, it's said by this summer, maybe relay inclusion lists. I do think what's interesting to add here is that, for example, blob scaling, it seems like there's a lot of space for us. Like right now, we transport all blocks on all blocks, and then imagine that all blocks for a relay isn't the one that makes it every 12 seconds. It's the couple thousand that we get from all the builders every 12 seconds, right? And we're sending all of them, right? So it's horribly inefficient still, and there's so much space for us to scale that still. So yeah, if the protocol says like, hey, we want to increase the throughput, then definitely plenty of space on our side, and starting to like read these proposals and engage with the ones that we think yeah, make a lot of sense.
And maybe just to briefly say, so this is another example we can think about. As I said before, right, the happy path and robust path, and I think right now we're not really leveraging the fact that different entities in the system have very different, like just real on the ground capabilities. So like a solo staker in a basement, that's basically already at the limit. We want to make sure that their load doesn't get worse, right? But then also like maybe the best way they can contribute to the protocol is just with very lightweight tasks like attestations, like censorship resistance duties, these kind of things. Someone like a relay, right now we basically give them the same type of load that a basement solo staker has. In reality, like what we can do is we can basically much more lean into that they have very like high bandwidth interconnects, that basically they can be basically very, very efficient first hop seed nodes for the peer-to-peer network. And so as we really lean into the scaling, I think we will, of course, carefully, because if they ever go offline, we need to be able to fall back in a way that doesn't bring down the network, and we will always make sure of that. But like, I think just intuitionally, I think really just actually making use of the real resources that are there in the system instead of just having this very simplistic model, I think there's a lot of headroom for us.
Phil?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the changes are very thoughtful when it comes to the block building market, which is great to see. My experience of a lot of it is people will find me at an event like this, drinking some coffee and say like, hey, do you like this? And describe some change that like utterly offends my like artistic sensibilities. And I'll say, no, this is like terrible. And this iterates a bunch and I become very bearish about the future direction. And then they propose something that's like actually not that bad after like 200 iterations. So I think it's actually nice to see. I think the process is working. I think the EF team specifically has pretty good taste in like how to affect block building versus not. So a lot of these changes that are like layering proofs, et cetera, I'm like pretty excited about and I think are pure value adds. Probably the two more interesting ones to talk about that are more substantive from at least my perspective. One is obviously inclusionless fossil. I think that's a whole interesting conversation. I'm going to try to talk a little bit about it later during my talk. I think, yeah, it's a longer conversation to have. I think from a practitioner perspective, it's not necessarily solving all of our censorship problems. So like, what else do we need to do, et cetera, as a community? I think the other interesting one is kind of leaning into this like big node stuff is very, I don't know, kind of makes me a little bit afraid. I think it's useful, but from our perspective, at least as Flashbots, speaking now as Flashbots, like we do really want to decentralize this block building market. We're not sure that's actually even all the time shared by the community. Like some people might be okay with having it more centralized even in the broader space. But that is, I think, genuinely what we want to do in the long term. That requires decomposing a lot of what we have now, and that becomes like harder to do if we're like leaning on a lot of these things. So that's maybe one place I'm more afraid, just because if we fail to do this, people will be like, oh, Phil, you centralized the whole block building layer and invented this evil PBS Flashbots, evangelized it for years, and like, it's your fault. And all the people that I really care for at Flashbots that work very hard, some of whom are here, will also be personally blamed. So yeah, that is why I'm afraid. But I think it's, like you said, not an impossible thing to square.
And maybe in general, I think one interesting way of thinking about kind of Ethereum, the Ethereum lifecycle, and but maybe all just like the development stages over the last, I think maybe 5-6 years, I think the way Ethereum approached things was always very conceptual first, details more somewhere at the end of the pipeline. And I think that worked really well for some types of changes. I think that gave us the merge, these kinds of just like where it's really more about the conceptual right choices. But I think we neglected more the infrastructure side of things quite a bit. So the actual, like within the conceptual constraints, pushing what's like on what's actually possible, like the actual real properties the system has for users actually using it. My feeling is now we're kind of like swinging in the other direction on Ethereum. So now I think over the next few years, the focus will be much more on these like infrastructure questions. And that will come with the downside now in the other direction, right? I would assume that by default, maybe now the more conceptual questions will be a little bit, hopefully not neglected, but like less focused on. And so I think that's something where maybe the community is more used to keeping us honest on the infrastructure side and be like, hey, look, we haven't had any throughput increases for a couple of years. Stop with this abstract stuff, like actually give us some concrete benefits. And that was very, very useful and very helpful and helped us course correct here. But I think going forward, it's probably more the other way around. I think we will probably need more people that make sure that we are not just overly focused on just going like, like, I don't know, like the 10 to 100, basically, like just basically like scaling what we already have, but making sure that these conceptual questions are still being answered in a good way.
How are you for time, Chris? Okay. Should we leave time for questions or? Yeah? Okay. Then let's open it up.
Any questions from the audience? I know it can be daunting when the big brains talk about a protocol.
I can maybe fire off the first one while we wait. I'm very curious how you guys feel about the fallback path, as you put it before. Like, in how good of a position do you feel we are there? Is it really solid, and like at any point the optimized pipeline could fall apart and you wouldn't lose a night of sleep? Or is it more like, no, there's serious work to do if we want to make sure the fallback path maybe works today, but more interesting, keeps working a year or two from now?
I think right now it's basically there's just not that much of a difference between the two paths yet, and so that's why I think right now it's very improvised. Really, the only thing we have is kind of the MEF boost, like, oh, if the network looks unstable, we just all fall back to local building. That's like a very, very basic, it's like one bit of decision making, basically. That works for the purpose it needs to fill, but it's also just nothing special. I mean, as Phil was saying, right, like leaning into more relying on heavy nodes is definitely not something you'd want to do carelessly. And I think some other networks are willing to just make that trade-off much more. I think as you do that, you really need to think very hard about whatever happens if those nodes either just completely disappear tomorrow from the network, like in all places, or start doing something malicious, right? Like in some cases one is worse, in some cases the other is worse. And then that you really need like much, much more sophisticated, much more robust sad paths that still make everyone happy eventually. I don't know if that's a good answer or not.
Any questions from the audience? All right.
There's a question, I think, in the very back.
Oh, nice, Devansh.
Yeah, I've heard it said like in some places that after the merge, we were a bit like directionless, and it was kind of like a wasted opportunity to not have like full focus on something and get things done. So I guess how much would you agree with that sentiment that after the merge, there was like a period of indecision and like not the best utilization of resources?
I don't think I would quite agree with that description, but there's some truth in there. I think basically we had the roll-up-centric roadmap, and the roll-up-centric roadmap was directionally like a very good approach to things, but I think it took us too long to be a bit more nuanced about it. And so for the longest time, we were basically like, well, the L1 can just completely ossify, at least on the execution side, because its main purpose is really just the settlement. And settlement you can do with relatively low throughput. And I think it took us a while to realize, and that should have been quicker, I think, that you really want a very healthy, a very robust, strong L1 at the core of the L2 ecosystem, because just pragmatically, that is a much better way to scale rather than basically just having to be completely reliant on that the L2s do the things you want them to do. So I think being quicker at having a more nuanced view of the roll-up-centric roadmap, I think, is something we definitely should have done. But in terms of implications for the roadmap, at least, I think in the meantime, we basically just focused on creating this path for data availability, which was still very useful. So yeah, I don't think it was completely wasted or indecision or something. I think it took us too long to reflect on the path. That makes sense. I don't know if you agree with that.
Any final questions? All right, then yeah, thanks a lot to our panelists. Thanks a lot, Kubi, for moderating, and all of you for coming on stage for this. Quick round of applause.